So as long as the target behavior is occurring, then reinforcement is being delivered, right? So we always compare this. This is the easiest one for when you're, on an elliptical in the gym, right? So as long as those pedals are moving and those arm mechanisms are moving, then your TV is on and you're able to watch your shows. But as soon as that, that pedaling behavior stops, then the screen goes blank again. So you have to engage in the behavior to access the reinforcement. So as long as the behavior is happening, reinforcement's delivered. As soon as the behavior stops, reinforcement stops as well.
The transition to focusing on service provision in early childhood really moved a lot of behavior analytic work, not only clinical work, but also research, into early childhood and focusing on children's services. And particularly with respect to funding and licensure and all of those fun things. But we're starting to see a change in this, and folks are doing really good clinical work and research in community-based environments for adults.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Cooperant Learning Podcast. We have a really, really exciting show today. We have a schedule of reinforcement that's not often talked about that I'm excited to talk about. We have adult participants in behavior analytic research, so I'm also excited about that. We have two esteemed guests that I'm very, very excited to have here. But first with me, as always, is Dr. Steve Sparks. Hi, Steve. How's it going?
We're hanging in there. We're all right.
It's October in the Midwest.
Yeah, someone said, have a good Monday. I said, or Wednesday. And I said, have a Wednesday. It's about where we're at. So
That's okay. That's okay. Hopefully this will make it a little better. That's the goal.
It'll be
here, so
much better from this point on.
Our guests today are Dr. Claudia Dozier and Dr. Katie McHugh. They are the authors of Synchronous Reinforcement Schedules Promote Tolerance of Health-Related Routines for Adults with Disabilities. This is out in the summer edition of Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. Katie and Claudia, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. We're super excited to be here.
Yeah, awesome. Let's take a minute and Claudia, we'll start with you. Take a minute and just introduce yourselves to our listeners and just let us know all about you.
Sure. My name is Claudia Dozier. I'm a professor and chair of the Applied Behavioral Science Department at the University of Kansas. I've been here for 18 years, believe it or not. My research has been really focused in clinical environments in which me and my graduate students work. So early childhood environments for a long time, as well as adult service environments. And it spans both translational and applied research and across the lifespan. And the topics are assessment and treatment and prevention of behavior disorders, classroom behavior management, staff training, obviously schedules of reinforcement, particularly schedules of covariation, and preference and reinforcer efficacy.
So welcome, me. Katie, go ahead.
Mine's not as impressive as Claudia, but I had the privilege of working in Claudia's lab. So I was one of Claudia's doc students. So I went to KU for my PhD. This study actually is a very abbreviated version of my my dissertation. So very proud to be getting this out to the masses. Right now, I am a clinical director at a clinic in Kansas City that we serve preschool age kiddos with autism for ABA services. So I'm loving that right now, and being close to KU feels like my home away from home. But I'm actually originally from Canada. My undergrad was in speech pathology, and then made the change to ABA for my master's and never looked back since. So that's my little backstory.
Well, that's fantastic. This research, we'll get started. First and foremost, adult participants in behavior analytic research. We had Dr. Allison Cox on earlier and Nazareth Kokar. They're talking about their research into just the last few decades, very little research with adult participants in behavior analytic research. What kind of led to you guys utilizing adult participants in that capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. A lot of earlier work in behavior analysis was with adults, a lot of it in institutions and other adult service environments. So, for example, a lot of the functional behavior assessment and treatment of challenging behavior literature back then was with adult participants. And then things like, so my major professor did research on things like safety behaviors, like crossing the street and teaching people how to use transportation and increasing independence in activities of daily living for adults. But I think and it's probably been talked about, if Allison was on here, it's probably been talked about, is the transition to focusing on service provision in early childhood really moved a lot of behavior analytic work, not only clinical work, but also research, into early childhood and focusing on children's services. And particularly with respect to funding and licensure and all of those fun things. But we're starting to see a change in this. And folks are doing really good clinical work and research in community-based environments for adults. So folks like Peter Gerhardt at the EPIC School and Rutgers University. So there's several folks there that are doing clinical and research work. Rachel Taylor out at the Center for Applied Behavior Analysis in California, and then us at KU. And this is really, I tell my graduate students this all the time, like I started in behavior analysis with adults with IDD. And so this is sort of like full circle for me. And I'm not at the end of my career, but I'm at the later stages. And I really like the fact that I sort of started my career with adults with IDD, and I'm probably going to be ending my career doing clinical work, training graduate students to work with adults with IDD and doing research in this area. So it's kind of a passion for me, is working with this population. And I also think that we're going to continue to see more clinical work and more research in this area, because those kids that got early intervention, they grew up to be adults and they still need support. And but I think what I'd like to see is some more advocacy for behavior analysis services for adults, more funding streams. And then I think we need to get those parents and caregivers to be champions of behavior analytic services for those grown-up kids, right? And then the last thing is we need to have more master's and PhD programs where people get training, because it's a very different environment than an early intervention environment, not only with respect to the population, but with respect to laws and policies, with respect to staff training, and just how to sort of work within the context of that culture and that environment. So,
yeah, I very much appreciate when I see people publishing and talking about this line. Since I started my doctorate school program, I think 2012. That's all I've done is the adult side, but through that program, I was still doing some research and things in the autism world. And at one point, we actually designed a paper like first steps. Here's something that parents can do to get started before they start getting services.
yeah,
Try to put it into some parenting magazines. Finally got one to bite. He said, "But I need you to write in here that behavior analysis is just for small children with autism and nothing else." And I'm like,
wow,
I can't do that. And then they just stopped answering me altogether. And so that's
there's so
part
much
of the reason.
misinformation.
Yeah, that's part of why what we're doing here is so much about bringing people that are doing things other than that, because we want the world and behavior analysts to know that it's other things as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. I echo all that. I appreciate what your mission is there, and it's really cool that it went full circle like that.
It is really, it really is.
And I think it gives Claudia,
okay.
I think it gives Claudia a really interesting perspective, and she allows her grad students to do that as well. I had only worked with children and children's services and some teens, and immediately she's like, "Great, you'll go into adult services." And I was terrified because I had never worked in that realm before. And even though I'm back to preschool now, it really hit home that early intervention is so important, right? These are the skills that we need to be teaching in order to set these folks up for success, because we had, folks that we served that had been institutionalized and were in physical and chemical restraint for most of their life. And that's not where we want these individuals to be. So I think even if your goal is not to work in adult services, it's an important experience to have, and one that Claudia really kind of instills in her students.
That's fantastic. That's amazing. You're speaking our language. I could talk all day on this one, but we'll move on to the topic at hand. But on that note, health-related behaviors. So at Sparks Behavioral Services, this is something that we often get called in for is health-related behaviors, primarily either intolerance or refusal to engage in health-related behaviors, things like going from brushing teeth or going to the dentist to blood draws, or even more serious cases like refusal to engage in like dialysis and things like that.
Yeah.
So you tackled this topic in your research. What health-related behaviors did your participants, what were you working on increasing or improving in your research?
hmm For the participants that we included in this study, we had two groups. So we had one group that it was increasing tolerance of daily routines, so things that they would do once or more a day. So toothbrushing, hand washing, hair brushing, things of that nature. And then we had another group of individuals who had to increase tolerance to things that they would have to wear longer term, right? So that weren't kind of broken down into those steps. So we had one individual that he engaged in severe elopement. He would run far and fast and long. So it was really important that we got a GPS tracker on him. So, we had that purchased, and, they tried to put it on him on his ankle initially, thinking that, oh, maybe it won't be as bothersome. He had it chewed off within 20 minutes. So light work for him. So we really needed to increase tolerance to wearing that, because if he did run, it could be really dangerous for him.
And he had been
Yeah.
hit by a car before too,
Yes.
hadn't he?
Yes.
Like
yes.
he was quick and
and no sense of safety skills were just not there. He would run to access emergency services, so he was really into like ambulances and fire trucks and things like that. And I think after that incident happened where he was hit, fire trucks and ambulances came. So,
Oh, no.
so he was one that was, very important for him to increase the tolerance to that. We also had an individual who had gait issues. So she had a lot of incidences where she would fall in her group home, where she had broken her nose. She, basically couldn't walk more than a few steps without risk of falling, and had some head injuries and head trauma. So we had to increase tolerance to wearing a helmet for her. And then another participant, Davis, he was one that he had a lot of severe problem behavior, but during COVID, he got very, very sick, was hospitalized for a long time, and had some residual lung damage from that. So part of his protocols were taking his pulse ox, making sure that his oxygen levels were sufficient. And he would not tolerate wearing that device at all. And it wasn't just that, he'd fling the device, which he would, but he also engaged in severe problem behavior in terms of body rocking, where he would rock his body forward and slam it back. And this had happened. He was in his 60s at the time that we ran the study, but he had such a history with that self-injurious behavior that he actually detached his retinas and was blind because of this behavior. So, we had those two groups, the ones that kind of dealt day to day with, those different routines, and other ones where it's more like one-off of things that were new to them, and they had to kind of increase that tolerance.
So some really potentially life-saving skills here, at least for some of your participants, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Synchronous schedules of reinforcement. I wanted to talk a little bit, maybe just bring our listeners, for anybody who's unfamiliar, and for myself, get a better understanding of what a synchronous schedule of reinforcement is. This is how you taught your health-related behaviors. What is like a good working definition and some examples of synchronous schedules of reinforcement, and maybe some historical, like how it's been used in the research in the past too?
Yeah, for sure. So synchronous reinforcement schedules, it's one that you don't commonly read about. Like Claudia said, before entering the lab, I had never really heard about it before. So it's a schedule of reinforcement where the delivery of the reinforcer is perfectly synchronized with a target behavior that you're defining. So as long as the target behavior is occurring, then reinforcement is being delivered, right? So we always compare this. This is the easiest one for when you're, on elliptical in the gym, right? So as long as those pedals are moving and those arm mechanisms are moving, then your TV is on and you're able to watch your shows. But as soon as that, that pedaling behavior stops, then the screen goes blank again. So you have to engage in the behavior to access the reinforcement. So as long as the behavior is happening, reinforcement's delivered. As soon as the behavior stops, reinforcement stops as well. So, we've used this within our own lab a few ways, just as, we kind of learned more about the schedule. So previously we had done studies across our labs with adults and with kiddos with synchronous reinforcement for increasing mask wearing. So this happened during the pandemic when no one had wore masks before. And we had been using this in our lab for other things in more of a translational study where we had increased on-task behavior using synchronous schedules of reinforcement. And it was super effective for these kiddos, but also was more preferred when we assessed that. So when COVID hit and we had all these adults and kiddos in our preschool and our early intervention ABA program that were not tolerating wearing masks, we're like, let's try it. Let's see if it works. It is most effective when you can have a reinforcer that can be continuously delivered and is effective for behaviors that are also ongoing. So it's not as effective if it's just like a one-off behavior. It has to be something that is, ongoing and dynamic, because the reinforcer has to be delivered as well, as long as the behavior's, kind of being engaged in. So that's kind of how we did it within our lab, and how we've kind of applied it in terms of on-task behavior and then a lot of these tolerating health routines. And we've kind of been moving around in terms of group contingencies in SSR, and kind of working our way and see how that works, as well in terms of our preschool kiddos and different tasks as well.
Yeah.
Is it still considered synchronous reinforcement if it is not continuous like that? I'm just trying to think of in terms of so my master's project I did using auditory stimulation, pairing that as a reinforcer and then delivering it as part of the play skill. That way it wouldn't interrupt the play skill and you could continue on, because every time we tried to deliver a reinforcer, it interrupted the chain. But this sounds like it needs to be almost continuous, and you are losing it then if it does not occur. Is that correct?
Yeah. And so that's a really interesting thing about these types of schedules. So this synchronous schedule is a type of schedule of covariation. And so you've probably heard the schedule, a conjugate reinforcement schedule. That is also a type of schedule of covariation. And so in synchronous schedules, like Katie said, it's a type of schedule of covariation that is continuous and what folks call non-episodic schedule, that as long as the behavior is happening, reinforcer's on. Behavior pauses, reinforcer pauses, right? And with the conjugate schedule, it's the same thing. There's moment-to-moment changes in the response, results in moment-to-moment changes in the reinforcer, but some dimension changes. So rather than an all or nothing like in a synchronous schedule, some dimension of the reinforcer, like the intensity of the reinforcer, changes. So a common everyday example is how much you depress the gas pedal is how fast you go forward, right? Going back to Katie's example of the elliptical machine, right? A synchronous schedule is you're moving the pedals, the TV's on. You stop moving, it pauses. A conjugate reinforcement schedule would be something more like you're moving the pedals, and as you move faster, the screen is clearer. And as you slow down, it gets blurrier. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, schedules of covariation, but how they're set up are very different.
And I'm always really stressing, and I'm sure I've said this on 10 of our episodes now. I don't know if we have 10, but really stressing the idea of the magnitude of reinforcement and how much we can do with that without having extinction and that sort of thing, and how it seems like there's a lot of lack of research, or at least articles on the ways to use that in our field. But it seems like it's such a powerful thing that we can use to really be successful.
Absolutely. I also think that, Katie said there isn't much research in this area. Like the schedules of covariation were often used as a tool to study other things in the early literature, right? So it started with Ogden Lindsley doing research on essentially trying to figure out how quickly people come out of coma, or when people are coming out of comas, or how quickly people come out of anesthesia. And so there was a button that he had them press. And so if they were awake, they would press the button to make the noise that they were hearing go down. And so he would know when they were coming out of anesthesia. And so that's how it was used as a tool to study other things. It was used as a tool to study child development. So you've probably heard of like the infant mobile studies, where a child's leg was attached to a string or a ribbon, and the force with which they moved their leg what resulted in how much the mobile moved, right? So the response was associated on a moment-to-moment basis with the output, the reinforcer. And so they used that type of preparation to study things like preference. And, do infants prefer their mother's voice versus somebody else's voice, or their mother's face versus somebody else's face? So it was used as a tool. There hasn't been that much research on actually using it as a schedule to change behavior. And to me, that's sort of surprising, because there's a really great paper by Williams and Johnson in 1992, and they talk about these types of schedules of reinforcement and compare them to like the schedules that you were talking about before, right? Most of the schedules that we program for behavior change are what are called episodic schedules. If you do this, then you do this. So FR1, FR2, 10, VR20, FI schedules, they're all behave and then get the reinforcer, behave and then get the reinforcer, right? So it's episodic, versus these non-episodic or continuous schedules are as the behavior's happening, it's producing reinforcement. And so in that paper, what they suggested is that we've done a ton of research on these episodic schedules that are likely not the type of schedules that are actually happening in the natural environment. They're not these dynamic back and forth schedules that you're likely experiencing in your everyday world. And so it's kind of surprising when you think about it that we haven't done that much research on the degree to which those schedules actually happen in the real world and the degree to which they can be used to change behavior. Because it may be, if these type of schedules are what we're experiencing mostly in our environment, that we're more susceptible to behavior change with those schedules, and they may be more effective for us. Yeah. That's just a hypothesis. It's an empirical question, but I think it's one that needs to be answered.
And we really like this because the individual drives their access to reinforcement, right? So they are able to kind of be in control of how much they're going to access that reinforcer, and really kind of drive that on their own based on their own behavior. So for working with adults, that's really powerful. Some of these folks have not had a lot of control in their life. So being able to say like, yep, you can behave however you want to behave. If you do X, you will get Y. And that's pretty important. I think that adds a lot of social validity to this specific type of schedule, and something that I had never really seen before. Typically, it's someone else delivering the reinforcer, but they're in total control of how much they're going to access that.
It makes you think about how applicable this could be to treatment of problem behavior. So a child might engage in tantrum behavior, and it's reinforced by access to caregiver attention. But oftentimes the way that we envision that, or the way that we assess it, is in an episodic schedule. Tantrum, reinforcer, tantrum, reinforcer. And what actually is happening is that as the tantrum varies, the attention delivery varies. So as the tantrum gets longer or it gets more intense, the attention delivery might change in topography, might be longer in variation. Or an infant crying, like the intensity, pitch, or duration of the crying probably co-varies with latency to parent responding, the type of responding that parent delivers, the frequency that the parent delivers the interaction. And so like all of these are more dynamic processes that fuel behavior. And even like John Rapp has talked more recently about and written some papers on repetitive or stereotypic behaviors may actually be reinforced by, the behavior in and of itself produces the reinforcer. So how intense it is that your body rocking or hand flapping or pacing produces different types of reinforcers than if you were not doing it as intensely. And so sort of thinking about it that way may be beneficial for treatment.
So not to put you on the spot, and if it is putting you on the spot, we can glance over this part. But
he does
as you
sometimes.
are analyzing it, conceptualizing it, how do you determine it is synchronous reinforcement rather than a penalty contingency? And I'm asking this mostly because when we're working with behavior treatment committees who are refusing this, and any form of punishment is last case. If we were to say go into a home and every time someone became aggressive, we turned off the TV, we could actually get in trouble for that. But if we can reframe it as reinforcement, maybe not. And so that's why I'm wondering if is a way to reframe that in a way that would be helpful?
Sure. It is a reinforcement schedule. You behave, you get it, right? You stop behaving, it's not being delivered. You behave, you get it. But if we're going to talk about the principles by which it's effective, it's a response cost contingency.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? It's negative punishment. And that may be an important aspect of this intervention, right? It's salient.
Sure.
Much more salient than maybe some of our other types of schedules of reinforcement. And you actually see it. You see it playing out where, so right now we're doing a study increasing exercise behavior for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities with a synchronous schedule. And this is actually a study trying to look at how do we thin the synchronous schedule out. But when we're getting people to engage in the behavior using a synchronous schedule, they'll be exercising and then they stop or pause, and we'll pause the video or whatever we're using. And you see them starting to engage in behaviors to try to figure out what is it that they need to do and what the parameters are, right? For them to get it to come back on if you don't give them a rule, right? And so yeah, I mean, there's, it's likely that one aspect of what's resulting in behavior change is that response cost contingency.
And I think you can always argue too that whether the delivery of the reinforcer is what is reinforcing, or is it aversive not having the reinforcer, now you're escaping that aversive condition. You can always get into those theoretical arguments.
You can,
and Jessica Van Straten, Tom Ratkos, and I did some research. We haven't gotten it published because we needed a larger participant base, but just testing people from a lay audience or mental health system, how do we react to different terminology in our field? And so you say response cost or overcorrection. Oh no, could never do that. Yeah. I say, well, if this person urinates on the floor, we're just gonna have them clean the whole floor of the bathroom there to clean up the area. Oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Or
it's the way you talk about it. Yeah.
Or have them raid.
And there's research to suggest that people actually choose punishment procedures, interventions that involve punishment over interventions that don't. So one of my previous doctoral students, Erica Joette, she did a couple of studies here when we were actually in the early childhood environments, looking at token reinforcement and looking at the efficacy of reinforcement only token systems or response cost only token systems. Both were effective for a lot of the kids, but the kids resoundingly preferred the response cost over the earning. And when we put it in a choice paradigm for them, because what they liked is to keep their tokens. They like to have all their tokens at the beginning and keep them, not to start out with no tokens and have to earn them. And that's what they told us. These are preschoolers that could tell us why they were choosing it. And so you also have to consider what's preferred from the individual's perspective. Like you and I get to choose which therapy or treatment we want, and if a child or an individual wants a treatment that involves response cost, who are we to say no?
Yeah, I do wish we could get people at the state or federal level to understand that the restrictiveness argument is subjective. And Kyle and I actually did a presentation at Behavior Analysis Association of Michigan conference this past year where it is talking about, so what's more restrictive to a person that's in a home that, say, exhibits sexual deviant behavior, to go through this training process that might be aversive in the moment, or to be locked in this facility for the rest of their life?
Right.
They're not willing to have that conversation, but as behavioral scientists, I think we should be.
Yeah, agreed.
Yep.
And or like sometimes we would run up on things where, we with final rule and with clients' rights and everything, and we would run up on things where like we were suggesting something as a safety type situation for right now until we can figure out how to treat it. And they would say, no, that's a violation of rights. That's a restrictive procedure. So like an example would be a consumer who attacks the driver in a van. Mm-hmm. And they were telling us if we, for safety reasons, were recommending that they sit in the back of the van and not the front seat next to the driver, that was a restrictive procedure. And we, like that kind of thing where it's like, okay.
Yeah, we've had
Yeah.
as simple as we've taught these skills because it's an aversive situation. They become violent. Here's some coping mechanisms and steps to follow to then calm yourself down and then
Yep.
react in an appropriate manner. But we weren't allowed to test if it was effective because that was setting them up for failure. And so we just
Sure.
had to teach them and
Entrapment.
assume that it was going to work, or they'll come back to us if it doesn't. Sort of.
Yeah.
And it just seems a bit ridiculous when you think all we have to do is sit back and watch and then coach them through in the situation, or set up a situation and see if they use it.
Right.
I do want to chat, getting back to the paper.
Reel us
sorry.
back in.
Yeah, I know. We're doing, this is awesome though. We could make this a 3-hour podcast, I think. One approach that's commonly used for tolerating these health-related behaviors is the idea of desensitization or graduated exposure or something like that. How does this compare, in your opinion, and what you know from the literature? How does it compare? What are maybe some benefits or differences in the conceptualization of both when it comes to teaching these skills?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. So, when we started initially doing our literature review, graduated exposure was kind of where we started in terms of, existing literature on this topic. We also saw that like desensitization kind of fell under that umbrella, and stimulus fading as well. So when we really broke it down and looked at the literature and what they were doing and their methods, that kind of all fell together and melded in terms of, the common treatment. And it was the most common treatment that was used. And that involves breaking the treatment down into smaller steps, and then targeting each of those steps individually until the participant can eventually do all of those steps successfully. And there's a lot of success in the literature with that, right? Especially with tasks that can be broken down very easily in terms of task analyses. But it does require oversight from someone who knows what they're doing to make sure that those steps are broken down appropriately, that, there's a correct baseline, and making sure that we're targeting the right skill. When do we progress forward? What kind of reinforcer are we going to be delivering? But they can take time, right? So we have to do it in a very systematic way to ensure that we're hitting all of these steps, and that they're successful, and that they maintain when we move to the next step. But they require oversight from a clinician that knows what they're doing, and they create a ceiling effect, right? So we may limit ourselves in how fast we can actually hit the entire task analysis because, well, in baseline, they only did the first step. So then we work on the second step, unless, of course, they're doing probes throughout, which would be advised based on the literature to make sure that you're not creating that ceiling effect. But for synchronous reinforcement, the whole thing is there. You have the opportunity to engage in all of it. And we may see that it does take more time, and that the, time to kind of get through those steps are more gradual, but the opportunity is there. So we're not kind of having that ceiling that we're seeing in graduated exposure. And we'll talk about that later, I'm sure, but synchronous reinforcement, we've also been able to teach group home staff how to implement synchronous reinforcement. Yes. So that's something as well, that once we train them on how to use this, they're able to use it pretty well and pretty successfully. Easy to kind of generalize to other skills as well once they kind of have an understanding, which graduated exposure might be a little bit tougher and might need more supervision to kind of implement.
Yeah, it does seem like something that would be just in having trained group staff for many years, the simpler the better. It does seem fairly straightforward as far as a procedure goes. So that it's definitely cool. And I definitely want to talk about the training aspect later. But let's get into your study then. Go ahead. Sorry.
Say about the graduated exposure. So when we first started the studies that Katie was talking about during the pandemic to get people to wear masks, that's when we first started looking into the literature. And like Katie had said, we had done some other translational research comparing different schedules of reinforcement to synchronous schedules. But these sort of things were happening parallel. And we implemented the graduated exposure procedure first to increase mask wearing, and it was not working. Some of these folks' problem behavior was maintained by access to tangibles. So, and delayed reinforcement was not working for them. And so we're like, okay, so what do we need to do now? We're looking in the literature. And one day we're just like, well, why don't we see what a synchronous schedule does? We've done some work in this, and it was like effective. It worked. It got people to wear
Yeah.
their mask. It got people to wear their masks for long periods of time. And so I do think a really cool next step, and this might be jumping ahead, but a cool next step is to look comparing synchronous schedules to graduated exposure, or what are the situations under which you might need to combine them.
Oh, cool.
So, and we've actually done that for one of our kids that we ended up combining desensitization and synchronous schedules. But I think that's a really cool area of research. So
Yeah. At the risk of going off topic again, I'd be really curious what that looks like.
Oh, the combination.
Yeah, combining
Yeah.
them.
So one of the kids in the mask at one of our mask studies, they would not even put the mask anywhere near their face.
Yeah.
So that we could
My
not.
uncle's like that.
Yeah, right. So we could not even implement synchronous schedules, right? Because if you're not doing it at all, which might be a limitation of synchronous schedules alone, if you're not doing it at all, then you can't deliver the reinforcer and the person doesn't come into contact with the synchronous schedules. So, and they
Gotcha.
have to for the behavior to change. So what we did was we did some systematic desensitization stuff where it allowed the individual, the child, to experience the synchronous schedule. So we had dramatic play items in the preschool where big goofy glasses on her face or the fancy boa around her neck. So that we would have her, which she would do, we would have her wear things on her face and on her neck, but that were more like play type things so that she could experience things on and around her face and come into contact with that synchronous schedule. And then we slowly moved from a mask with just the ear loops and strings to a smaller and smaller hole such that it was just the mask.
Okay.
And then we were able to get her to wear the mask. So it was a combination of synchronous schedules and systematic desensitization.
That's such a cool, creative, and pragmatic use of behavior science. I love it. It's very, very cool.
Thank you.
Going back to the study, let's dive into it then. As far as the interventions with your participants, how successful was synchronous schedules, and were there any modifications or changes that you had to make along the way?
Well, yes, we learned lots from this study. So I think we looked at the synchronous schedules alone, but we did need some modification. So for folks like Louise, synchronous schedules were effective at increasing her tolerance to all of her routines. She loved SSR. It was enough for her. For two of our participants, so for Caitlin and for Charles, we had to make some modifications. Now, remember, those two were to increase tolerance to devices, right? So a helmet for Caitlin and a GPS anklet for Charles. So these were items that they had to tolerate for long periods of time. And they were safety. We needed them on. So for them, we did some modifications in terms of we used synchronous reinforcement, and what we saw was for Caitlin and Charles, what we saw is that they would tolerate it, and then they would kind of go to remove it. It was Caitlin mostly from her helmet, from her head. And we kind of thought, well, what if we just like reminded her of the contingency and like kind of block that response, and then if she still removed it, then we would let her contact that schedule of that removal of the reinforcer. So what we did was add a response block in a prompt, right? So she would go to remove it, and we'd say, hey, remember, if you want to watch your music videos, you have to keep your helmet on. And that was pretty effective for her. It was just those reminders were enough to let her know that, okay, it's worth it. I'll keep the helmet on. And we were able to increase her tolerance very gradually, and she was very successful with that modification. For Charles, he's the one that he keeps things interesting. So we kind of talked about Charles previously in terms of his elopement. Charles also engaged in severe problem behavior in terms of physical aggression. So he had a long history with the Dozier lab in their services. So, we knew him very well. And hindsight's always 2020. But what we did for him is we implemented the block and prompt as well. So, when he would go to take it off, because what we did with his device was we cut it and put Velcro, so it's easily removable. So if he went to remove it, we would block and say, hey, remember, if you want to watch your videos, you got to keep your anklet on. And that was effective for a while, but then he continued to remove it. He also engaged in, when you would go to put it back on, because it was his foot, he would give a quick kick and a laugh. He caught on to us very quickly. He was onto us. He was actually one that we had to get the staff to implement with, because he started targeting one of my fellow grad students. As soon as we walked in for those sessions, he was like, "It's on."
Chasing her around.
Yeah. So he's very smart. So he's one that we used a response cost in terms of he loved emergency vehicles, and he'd carry around trucks, so like fire trucks. So if he engaged in that physical aggression, we would remove his fire trucks. This was already in his behavior plan. So this was something that he already had contact with. They had a ton of success with this protocol. Very simple. He would hand it to you. He would hit you and hand you that truck. He knew exactly what the contingency was. And probably in hindsight, we should have included that off the hop, because again, he learns very quickly, but we didn't. So I got to learn something about, that kind of inclusion in your protocol. But for him, that was effective, was adding that response clause. So we had synchronous schedules where he could watch his videos of emergency vehicles responding. We would, if he went to go remove it, we would block and remind him, like, hey, remember, if you want to watch these, you have to keep it on. And then if he engaged in physical aggression, we would remove the trucks for a period of time and then get them back. And then for Ava, our one participant where we were not actually successful with, identifying a reinforcer for her. So we started with synchronous schedules. We had a very hard time identifying a reinforcer that was powerful enough for her. And so what we did was we included contingent edibles. So if we got through those steps, we would add edibles to a cup, because that was, reinforcing to her. And at the end, she could have access to that. Still weren't getting a lot of success. So we broke it down and just used, graduated exposure. We were successful at 2 steps. So let's try it at just 2 steps. And included the edible and the synchronous, and we still couldn't get it. We were not able to kind of identify a reinforcer. Staff were incredible helping us brainstorm. We talked about this in many lab meetings about, different ideas. But unfortunately, we were just not able to find a reinforcer that was conducive to being delivered continuously. Also, when she was targeting toothbrushing, we can't give her food while we're brushing teeth. It's not really compatible and kind of counter-therapeutic. So for her, that was not something that we were successful in this study, but it was something that we continue to address within lab, because she was one of the consumers that we served and supported. So trying to identify a reinforcer. Anecdotally, we did know that she loved the shower. So something that we talked about was like, can we brush your teeth in the shower? That's totally appropriate. People do that, right? And that is a totally appropriate way to kind of encourage that behavior. But obviously for many reasons, that was not going to be something that we targeted within a research study.
Gotcha. Would that be a maybe not a common issue, but maybe a concern, is like the reinforcer wouldn't lend itself or be compatible with this idea of synchronous or continuous exposure to? I'm trying to brainstorm what that might look like, and I'm coming up short, but there might be something that you've ran into.
Yeah, I think we learned this a lot with our first few studies. iPads are wonderful things. Media is a great way. So if they are reinforced, if media is reinforcing to them, music videos, YouTube, we use TikTok for one of our participants. So if that is a really nice reinforcer to use, but something like, and even an edible, and you can continuously give that, but there are a lot of, kind of questions about that. And even in our, our study with our kiddos with our masks, we use toys, right? They had access, some of our kiddos, their reinforcers were, access to toys and things like that. But yes, there are times where the reinforcer just does not lend itself to a continuous delivery, and it's just not something that that schedule is appropriate for. And that's okay, because we have other schedules for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's a big consideration for when people are thinking about whether to use this schedule. First off, the behavior has to be a more continuous behavior. It has to be a more
Right.
duration-based behavior. And the reinforcer, you have to find a reinforcer that you can deliver in a continuous, non-episodic way, right? So you often see auditory and visual stimuli delivered in that way. So music or videos or attention. We've delivered attention as synchronous schedule before. High preferred conversation as long as you're doing X. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions too, and I think you covered it quite well. Is just you talk about the magnitude of the reinforcer for the behavior you're trying to increase, but the magnitude of competing reinforcers as well. When Kyle mentioned the person or one of the people that wouldn't do dialysis, and it was due to the attention and turmoil
Yeah.
due to not having that, and we could not compete with it. We never did find a reinforcer to compete with the amount of attention for being near death continuously.
Yeah. Yeah. I worked with a client many, many years ago and who had very severe self-injurious behavior. And he had many years before taken an antenna off the top of a TV and sliced his stomach open. And so a lot of part of his intestines were on the outside.
No.
And he had to wear like a pouch around. And it was the same thing. He had a 2-to-1 staffing ratio. And still sometimes he was able to get in and pull that out. And he knew what would happen. Emergency vehicles would come and, he'd get all the things. And it's hard to not have emergency vehicles come and do all kinds of crazy things when you've just pulled your insides out,
There are times you cannot stop that.
Yeah. And there is something to technology being a factor too. I mean, I never heard. I mean, I don't know if this is real I don't do elliptical machines, but is that an actual contingency? Like if you stop doing it, the TV that's a great idea.
Fancy ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought immediately as you were saying that my daughter has a flashlight, but it's like a mechanical thing. So there's no battery. You just spin it and we play flashlight tag, but she has to continuously be spinning it. And then I win once she gets tired because she can't do it anymore. So
Exactly. And a lot of toys are like that, like play lightsabers and things like that. You have to continuously press it down for it to do the thing.
Yeah. But with health-related behaviors, specifically exercise behavior, that seems like a really, really interesting, and there's probably a lot that I'm unaware of, but it seems like an interesting road to go down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Getting into the staff training part. So again, we talked about a little bit before, but this was another big part of the paper was getting caregivers trained to high treatment fidelity of these procedures. So do you want to go into what that looked like and your success with that?
Yeah. For the baseline, it was mostly experimenter implemented, but we also did some staff probes. So what happened was I had all the steps of either the task analysis or the routine of, tolerating the item. I had it all written down and I would review it with staff. So these were staff that knew these folks really well. They were in their home. They were with them, 12 hours a day, several times a week. So they already had relationships with these folks. So they know what their routine looked like. They likely helped me develop the task analysis for all the steps because they're the ones that implement it. So we kind of talked about making sure in baseline that, they present the steps, they walk through all of them. If there's any interfering behavior, back off, give them a break. Once the behavior stops for 5 seconds, then you can hop back in and continue with what you're doing. So we just kind of loosely coached in baseline. And then when we went into full staff training, we would train, a team of them because there's more than, there's front half, back half, and group 1 staff, night shift, day shift. So we used training in terms of BST. So we, again, went over all of the written instructions, all of the definitions of the specific target behavior for that participant. For any of their challenging behavior, we went through all of those. And we went through the different steps. And then we would model it for them and show them what that looked like. And then we would let them implement, and then we would kind of coach throughout if they needed it. Staff were incredible. We have come such a long way with this this agency in particular, their staff are amazing. They were so open and welcome to working with us. They had previously done it in the mask study. We did that virtually just because of COVID. So a sample of the staff, not these participants, but had kind of the word on the street was that this was kind of working. So I think we got some buy-in from that. And we had just built some pretty incredible relationships with these homes specifically. And they were able to do this and do it well and very, very quickly. So
Wow.
we were super, super lucky with this group of staff.
That's great. We run into so often great staff and well-intended staff. Turnover though is a huge
Turnover's
in
huge.
our applied setting. I don't know if that's a barrier that you face at all.
Yes.
Very difficult. We get somebody trained to mastery 100%. We come back the next week and nobody's the same.
Yes.
They're all gone. So
Yeah. The
Yeah.
turnover, there's so many variables, right?
Yeah.
And to be able to change the turnover, and having to target all of those variables will be difficult.
And
Yeah.
we tried
I
for
actually-
this one. Sorry. We tried for
No,
this
go ahead.
one to train one of the managers, so one of the leads of the house that were maybe a little bit more stable, and had been there for a little bit longer. So they were kind of like the point person that we would work with, and then just everyday staff. But yes, that's definitely a barrier, and the relationships that we have built with this agency have been a long time coming, and our previous doc students and grad students and Claudia and faculty at KU have done a lot of work. Initially, I love the first story Claudia tells us is that, we weren't always welcome, and that's okay because we were,
Oh, yeah.
they were no longer locking the door when they saw us approaching. So that's a good sign. That's a good sign, to the point where they would call and ask for help. So it was work. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but these staff in particular are pretty special.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's gotten somehow harder since COVID for a lot of our relationships, and maybe because we couldn't be in there for a period of time. But we've actually started a new company housing the most severe behavior cases in our state, where we can train staff, and they kind of have to follow the contingencies, and we're still having to offer an extra couple dollars an hour just for effective implementation and showing up on time and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
it is definitely a barrier that we see quite a bit of.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Rounding out on our hour a little bit, what questions still remain? What would you, what is your lab working on now that kind of plays off of the results of this study? And what limitations are there that you're exploring? And yes, all of those questions.
All the things, right?
Yeah.
So like with respect to considerations or limitations of synchronous schedules, I already talked about the fact that it needs to be a continuous reinforcer. It needs to be a continuous behavior that you're wanting to change. But some other things to consider is that sometimes this type of contingency or schedule would not be applicable if it interferes with the behavior that you're wanting to change, right?
Okay.
So if it's a more complex behavior where you may need to attend to something, and providing that reinforcer continuously would interfere with something like reading or studying for some people. Like I'm a person that I can't work with music on, right? And that would interfere with me doing good work. Whereas my husband, he always works with music on, right? It's something that actually increases the likelihood that he's working. So
don't tell my my advisor, but I wrote my dissertation watching movies in the background. So.
yeah, exactly. And some people, like, that's just how they it doesn't interfere with them doing good work, or it might interfere. The delivery of the reinforcer might interfere with other people being around. So really thinking about how can we deliver, a reinforcer. Can we deliver this type of reinforcement within the context of a classroom? And if you do, how do you do that, right? The other thing that we've had tons of conversations about is, for example, in Katie's study, if you are using a synchronous schedule to increase tolerance of toothbrushing. Toothbrushing takes about 2 minutes. So a staff could deliver synchronous schedule for 2 minutes, no problem. Most people can take 2 minutes out of their time to do that, right? But if you're wanting the behavior to happen for a longer period of time, you're not going to be able to continue to implement synchronous schedules. So like in Katie's study on getting folks to wear masks, we want folks to wear masks all the time. We can't deliver a synchronous schedule all the time for folks to wear masks, right? So we need to either the behavior continue to happen after the synchronous schedule is pulled, or we need to figure out how to fade it. Interestingly, in Katie's study, for a lot of those folks, after we got up to a 30-minute schedule of them wearing their mask, we could just pull it and it didn't reverse to baseline levels. They'd just wear it. And so that might suggest that synchronous reinforcer is the pairing of it with the mask wearing is decreasing the aversiveness of it or resulting in habituation, right? But if you can't just remove the synchronous schedule after they experience it some and the behavior maintains, how do you thin it? And so that's a big study that we're running right now, and it's with the exercise, is if we want the behavior to continue to happen after we get it happening in a synchronous schedule, how can we get it to maintain? And so looking at, can we switch from a synchronous to a non-contingent reinforcement schedule? If that doesn't work, can we switch from a synchronous to like a hybrid synchronous and NCR schedule? So like the first 5 minutes is an SSR schedule, and then thereafter it's an NCR schedule, so that there doesn't have to be someone there delivering the reinforcer the whole time. So that's a big study. We also did, like Katie said, we did a study in the preschool classrooms on using synchronous reinforcement within the context of a group contingency. For cleanup behavior. Kids don't like to clean up, right?
They don't.
Cleanup time, they're like this, right? And so it's like 3 kids are cleaning up and everybody else is still playing or doing something
That
else.
might be me too.
That what?
That might be me also, yeah.
So we did that in groups of kids and we saw an increase in their cleanup behavior. So that was kind of cool. And then we looked at side effects because, group contingencies, a lot of discussion around group contingencies is there may be positive or negative side effects with respect to peer interactions or what peers say to you. And what we saw was a lot of peer support. You can do it, clean up like me, those kind of things, right? Okay. So that was a really neat study. We learned a lot in that one too. So I think this is an area of research that will continue to go down as questions come up. It's been fun.
And we also talked about it in terms of the mass study, because we did see that effect, that maintenance effect, when we went back to baseline, but we didn't see it in this study for a lot of our participants. And we talked about, is it the amount of time that they were exposed to SSR, or was it the history with the item? Masks were new. No one had dealt with masks before. So, maybe because this was a new thing in their life, they didn't have that history of those aversive events, right? It also wasn't painful for these folks versus, brushing your teeth. If you haven't brushed your teeth in a very, very long time, that can be painful, right? So knowing, history of, how aversive the routine is itself, and whether we have to do longer exposure, and like Claudia said, that pairing, we don't really have those answers yet. So getting more information about that as well could be useful in terms of being able to fade out that schedule in a more effective way.
I'd say conceptually that pairing with then the NCR moving forward makes a lot of sense. We just at the beginning of the session there and maybe it just needs to be looked at further. Did you see any issues with maybe the reinforcer being used or possibly paired losing its effectiveness over time? Say the TV is more reinforcing for the first half hour than it is for hour number 2 or that sort of thing, and so it lost some of its effectiveness at all?
I don't think we saw that, but we also didn't do sessions any longer than an hour for anybody.
Okay.
I don't think we did. Katie, can you think of any? We also had variety, which may have helped with that. So it wasn't the same TV show at the beginning of the session. They got to choose, like you get the iPad, choose whatever you want to watch.
Yeah, they could navigate around and change up however they wanted. And they had playlists that were programmed based on preferences.
Yeah, so that may have helped with that. Or if we use toys, like for some of the kids in the mask study, they got to choose which toys they played with and there were multiple toys available. So that may have helped sort of the variation in reinforcement.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking out loud, just a group contingency in a group home that we may now be setting up, and you may not be able to choose your individual favorite program all the time. And it'd be interesting. Maybe we can collect some data on how that may work if we can set that up without being yelled at by the state for turn the TV off when target behavior occurs or something.
So I'll tell you, it's really interesting. What we started doing with that group contingency study is we did there's a study by, I think it was Stacy Layer and Greg Hanley and some more folks that was actually conducted here at KU before I got here, where they looked at, you know, how do you do a preference assessment for a group of people to figure out what you're going to run as a reinforcer? So we tried to do that type of preference assessment where each kid would come and tell us what song they wanted to listen to, right? And then we would, whichever song was picked the most, then that's what we would use, or the order in which, you know, the songs were picked the most. And we found that if their song wasn't picked, then they wouldn't clean up. And so what we ended up doing, which ended up working, is we said, you have to collectively decide together which songs you want to pick and the order in which you want them played. And so they got a couple of minutes before each session, and they had to decide together as a group, right? So there was like buy-in, what songs that they wanted to listen to, and that worked.
That makes way more sense than playing all their favorite songs at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
If they were anything like our kids at our house right now, Spooky Scary Skeleton Club remix, that would be the way, that would just work every time.
You guys, my graduate students would come to lab meeting and be like, if I hear the Frozen song one more time, I'm going to go insane, because they would pick like the same songs over and over and over again.
Yeah. Hey, believe it or not, it's been an hour, so I don't want to keep you too long, but so many topics that we touched on there. We'd love to have you both back sometime, because there's a lot of really, really cool stuff. And all the questions and research that you're doing, as you find those answers, we'd love to have you back to discuss that research too. So Dr. Claudia Dozier and Dr. Katie McHugh, thanks so much for joining Cooperant Learning today.
Thanks so much. We really enjoyed it.
Thanks, everyone.